access to property tax.
But at the same time, let's take a city like Colorado Springs, which is, and pretty much it's similar it's a big city. It's fairly similar size to Oklahoma City, maybe a little bit smaller. It has a regional transit authority that collects a very small amount of sales tax. The idea behind that was to expand service into the suburban areas. In 2008, the rest of the system was all done by sales tax-based city, and when the economic turndown came, much like right here, when your transit is competing with the fire department or the police department, transit services are not as essential as the police and not as essential as the fire department. Even though they had a regional transit authority, they still cut their service by more than 50%, as a result. So even if you do have a larger city that has a regional funding source or a dedicated funding source, the real question is that funding source in and of itself sufficient to cover the needs of the transit service? And that's another nuance of the question that you just asked, because even if you might have that, it might not be enough.
If I could make just a couple of comments. I think when we all called for this study, we were asked a couple of times whether or not we had the political courage to consider making some of these difficult changes. And I think, we're now seeing that some of these discussions are going to be really complicated and are going to affect a lot of folks. But I so much appreciate you're taking this on, and I think you answered a lot of the questions that we asked you to take a look at, and from the depth of the study, and I think the information's terrific that was presented to us today, so thank you for that. The words and the concepts of frequency and headway and, just the thought of being able to have 15-minute routes on these important corridors, I think go really far in addressing the desire to increase our ridership. And I think that most of us around here, would love to see that. If I interpret your numbers correctly, that our ridership per hour is 18 people.
Yes.
We've got buses all over the city that maybe have nobody in them, or maybe have one or two people in them. And I don't want to minimize the importance to those one or two people, but those numbers strike me as incredibly low. And as we look at, being able to take the gifts that this city has, which would include a grid and would include some very obvious corridors, I think you've really gone a long way. So that's a lot of commentary, but I did want to ask a question in terms of budgeting. And within these three scenarios, and again, we did specifically ask you to look at the budget that we currently have. And so, great work in trying to tackle some big adjustments within the dollars that we're currently spending. As I, for one, don't think we're spending those dollars very well at the moment. But have you put numbers to Tier 2 and Tier 3 of opportunity for us?
We created these in terms of hours, and then those were taken back and worked through the cost allocation model, and I don't know if we converted those into dollar amounts.
Yeah, we have taken on their recommendations. When you look at what's the cost of Sunday service, or what's the cost of the frequency enhancements, or the cost of running an extra 3 hours at night, we have put dollar cost to each of those. And just in a generalized sense, without getting into a lot of the detail, I mean, we go from roughly $1.1 million, which is our least expensive alternative, to about $2.5 million for the higher priced alternative.
Rick, we've proven by adding, as we did, adding frequency on a couple of routes, we've essentially documented that if you do that, you increase the ridership. I mean, I think we know that.
Yes, we've been very fortunate over the last several years when you've given us that incremental funding, and we have selectively chosen routes that we thought would be candidates to show increases, and we've certainly seen double-digit increases, sometimes over a very short period of time. And we've always said, at least give us a year, if not 2 years, because you have to demonstrate that you're going to be out there before people sometimes will make that change. And we've certainly seen in every route that you have helped us fund that we've seen increases.
So, and I think the combined hybrid approach is one that probably works too. If we can use some smaller vans or buses in some areas where we have some really specific pockets.
Yeah, the challenge that exists there, and I do need to speak to that because this is something I talk about from time to time, and I've certainly referenced it lately relative to the challenge that we're going to have in getting funding for buses is the fact that because we are heavily dependent on the federal government to help us pay for buses, they do restrict the number that we can have. So sometimes, we buy different size buses to try to balance the load. It's not as simple as taking a big bus off the street during the middle of the day if it's not as busy. We sometimes have to recognize that we've got to run that larger vehicle. And the reality is, when we're talking about a bus, now if you step down to a van, that's a different discussion. You're also talking about a significant ridership capacity change. But generally, think in terms of a 30-foot versus a 40-foot buses. The difference is really that 10 feet in the middle of the bus. It's the seats. It's not the expensive power source, the engine, the transmission, that sort of thing. So sometimes people are surprised that the cost savings is not as large as what you might anticipate. But when you look at it in that sense, that you're really just talking about taking seats out of a bus, the savings isn't always there as high. So,
I'm thinking a little bit more of the van concept, where we might be able to, and we're not going to solve any of these problems here, but given that they have broken ground on the Social Security office, maybe that's an interesting opportunity, that you stop your bus route 2 miles away, but you use a van on a rotating basis and take folks there. I don't know, but there may be some opportunities for some of those kind of things.
When we were made aware of the Social Security office, we talked about, there's a route that's within 2 miles, and not only does it have a cost implication of, going those extra, the deviating, but what it does is it messes up any connections that route may have with anything else. So we looked at what are potentially some more cost-effective ways of serving something like that. And given what the potential volume of riders is out there, quite frankly, a taxi voucher program is going to be your least costly and least impact on the transit system core, because not everybody goes to the Social Security office on an ongoing basis. You go once or twice a year. Well, you might go a little bit more often, but the average person does not go. It's not a everyday destination for most people. So trying to find a non-traditional, like a van or subsidized taxi service, might be the better way to look at that, or working cooperatively with a different transit agency that might go within a short distance of there might be another option.
Talking to the developer yesterday, they did express interest of helping to pay for the additional cost. But there's not been an agreement so far, but they did express it. So hopefully we'll be able to work something out.
Councilman White, you have a comment, question?
I had a comment about a couple of things. One thing, Councilwoman Salyer talked about the courage that we're going to have. I appreciate the fact that you were willing to list these additional resources scenario in order of priority. I mean, it would have been easy not to do that, just to list them, and I appreciate that you listed them in the order of that you think is the most important. But go ahead.
I just want to make clear that those are our priorities, and they may not reflect the community's priorities.
Absolutely. No, you made that very clear. You made that very clear. But I think just doing it that way makes it, because at some point in time you have to figure out how you're going to pay for all this. And when you get down to that point, whether you want to get the most bang for your buck, and then you have to start bringing those other things. But I just accept the compliment. I appreciate it. The second thing, though, with regard to this, the idea of if we have to go to a scenario where we, and it appears that we will have to really make any serious headway in this, we have to go to a scenario where we change the routes, where we eliminate some routes and add frequency to others. Have you looked at the impact of a delay in doing that, where you would notify people that this route is only going to be here for another 6 months or another year? Because a lot of, this is my own perception, a lot of transit-dependent people are not homeowners. A lot of times they live where they live because they choose to live there. And if they had, this is my own thought, is that they had a year to know that it wasn't going to change, then perhaps they would move to an area where they would be served, because the impact of not having the ability to get around is obviously going to impact their lives greatly. And if you have a thought on that, I'm preaching now, but
I'm going to say that I've seen market research that suggests that's the case. A transit trip, however, depends on two different pieces. not just the origin where somebody lives, but where that destination is. And I think the Social Security office is a great example of what happens if you shrink the boundaries and yet where you want to go to, where your job is or where it gets transferred to is no longer within those boundaries. So, while the person could, in theory, move, it's expensive to move, and it's an tremendous inconvenience, especially if you're transportation challenged in the first place. Right. You have to also look, are those destinations that those folks might be going to also within that shrunk area? I mean, we were, I'm going to say, very targeted and very conscious of, looking at how to shrink the service effectively.
I was cautioned to come up to the microphone to speak, so pardon my joining in here. But one of the other things that market research shows is that even if you tell people that their service is only going to be there for another 6 months, most people that are in that situation are either incapable of being able to make a move for any number of reasons, or they simply put it off, and the time comes. What happens, though, over time is that they will move to someplace else because of some other thing. Their job has moved, their church has moved, their grandmother has moved, whatever it is that causes them to move. And the other people that are making location decisions then see where the transit system is, and they say, I want to locate on a bus route. But I can't tell you how many phone calls that I got working for an agency for a number of years from people who had just moved into the community, and they never gave their transportation a thought about where they were going to locate. So they locate someplace a mile away from the closest bus route, and the first phone call they make when they get settled in and are trying to figure out how they're going to run their lives is to the transit agency and say, I live in so-and-so, and when am I going to get a bus in my neighborhood? So it's one of those things that really is widely varied among the population, but typically we find that new folks moving in are probably more attuned to where the transit system is than folks who are displaced by changing the route structure.
But that's good information, because that's the kind of thing that we're going to have to decide, if it's not cost effective or helpful to people that were going to be abandoned by the system to do it, then it's going to get down to how much it costs to do it at some point in time, and that's good information to have. I appreciate that.
In that regard, I think it's important that we have some public participation meetings where we take this plan out to the public and get their input in it before we finalize the plan. I think we ought to make a real effort to publicize those and make sure that we get as many people there as possible. Larry, you've got a question.
Just a question. I appreciate your comments and your thoroughness of your study. Just from an overview, I come from a business perspective, and in business, you have a product or a service, and you attempt to grow the market, and you're always anticipating that your revenue that you get will be greater than the expenses or the cost of providing that service. In that context, is it a fair statement to say that there are very few, if any, public transit systems in the United States where the amount of money that's collected from the fare box pays for the system to be operated?
There is no public transportation system in the country that recovers all of its costs from the fare box.
So as we go along here, there's going to have to be another source of funds to provide the type of service that we're talking about, and those type of funds would probably come in the area of increased taxes on everybody and or greater subsidies from like the federal government or these other sources. Is that a correct statement?
If one of the expansion scenarios is chosen, to move forward with, then the revenues for that would have to come from someplace, yes.
Thank you.
David, please.
Thank you. Just a quick question for clarification. Back on page 4 where you're showing total annual ridership, could you make an estimate if you divided that number, say, either by 300, which would give you a 6-day ridership, or by 260, which would give you a 5-day ridership, that we're serving approximately between 4,500 to 5,300 riders who, wouldn't most of the riders of the bus tend to use it more regularly, or are there very many people that use it once a year or something?